The Upton Boxing Centre was wrapped in an unusual silence that December afternoon. Calvin Ford walked slowly among the equipment, his calloused hands touching the heavy bags that had witnessed so many stories of transformation. At 68 years old, the veteran trainer carried the weight of decades dedicated to shaping young people from Baltimore's streets. But there was a secret he had kept for over 15 years, a secret that would forever change how the world saw Gervonta Davis. The fluorescent lights flickered irregularly, casting dancing shadows on the gym's peeling walls. Calvin approached an old wooden table in the corner of the establishment, where he kept his most precious records. His hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. For all these years, he had kept secret something that could have completely changed Gervonta's trajectory, but now, after so long, it needed to come to light. The distant sound of Baltimore traffic echoed through the fogged windows, reminding Calvin of the days when a skinny 8-year-old boy appeared at his door. Back then, Gervonta was just another kid lost in the city's violent streets, but Calvin saw something different in him, something that went far beyond natural boxing talent. There was a deep pain in that child's eyes, an untold story that Calvin discovered by chance and decided to protect with his own life. The years passed like pages turned quickly, and Calvin watched Gervonta transform from a boy haunted by his past into one of the world's most feared boxers. Each victory, each spectacular knockout, each title won carried with it the weight of this secret that only Calvin knew. The trainer knew that his decision to remain silent had been crucial in allowing Gervonta to focus on his career, but now circumstances were forcing him to break this silent pact. The decision to reveal the truth had not been made lightly. Calvin spent months reflecting on the consequences, weighing the pros and cons of exposing something so intimate and powerful. He knew that the secret he held would not only change public perception of Gervonta, but also explain many of the behaviors and attitudes the champion displayed inside and outside the ring. It was a truth that would further humanize one of the most misunderstood athletes of his generation. As afternoon turned to evening, Calvin made his final decision. He took an envelope yellowed by time, stored in a locked drawer for over a decade. Inside were documents, photographs, and letters that told a story of courage, sacrifice, and unconditional love that the entire world deserved to know. The secret about Gervonta Davis was about to be revealed, and Calvin knew nothing would ever be the same again. The story began on a cold winter night in 2002, when Calvin received a desperate call from Keisha, a social worker who worked in Baltimore's poorest neighborhoods. She had found disturbing information about Gervonta's family, information that could completely destroy the emotional stability of the boy who already showed signs of deep trauma. Calvin still remembered Keisha's trembling voice on the phone, begging him to meet her immediately at a discreet cafe downtown. At the meeting, Keisha revealed that she had discovered documents in old social services files that completely changed the narrative about Gervonta's origin. The boy didn't know the truth about his biological parents, and the story he knew was just an edited version created to protect him from an even more painful reality. Calvin felt the world crumble when Keisha showed birth certificates, medical reports, and testimonies that painted a devastating picture of Gervonta's first years of life. The truth was that Gervonta's biological mother, a young woman named Tonya, had struggled with drug addiction throughout her pregnancy. She had died just 3 days after giving birth, leaving behind a handwritten letter asking forgiveness from the son she could never raise. In this letter, Tonya revealed that she had chosen the name Gervonta because it meant protector, hoping her son would find strength to protect himself from the cruel world she was leaving behind. The biological father, Marcus, was a man who had disappeared before birth, leaving only a silver bracelet with his initials engraved. Calvin remained silent for long minutes after absorbing this information. He immediately understood why the family that raised Gervonta had chosen to hide this truth. The boy already carried enough trauma without having to deal with the additional weight of knowing his biological mother had died from drugs. The decision to keep the secret had not been made out of cruelty, but from protective love that recognized the emotional fragility of a child who had already suffered enough. Keisha explained that she had discovered this information by accident while organizing old files that were to be digitized. She knew that legally she should inform Gervonta about his true origin, but she also understood the devastating consequences this could have on a teenager who was finally finding purpose through boxing. The social worker was torn between her professional duty and her protective instinct, which is why she had sought out Calvin, knowing he was the only person who could make the right decision. Calvin took responsibility into his own hands that night. He asked Keisha to maintain absolute secrecy about the discovery, promising that he himself would reveal the truth to Gervonta when the appropriate time came. The trainer assumed the emotional weight of carrying this secret, knowing he was making a choice that could be questioned later, but at that moment was the only option that would allow Gervonta to continue his healing journey through sports. It was a heavy burden, but Calvin was willing to carry it for the good of his pupil. The following years were the most challenging of Calvin's life as a trainer. Every day spent in the gym with Gervonta was a constant reminder of the secret he carried. Calvin watched the young boxer train with an almost desperate intensity, as if fighting invisible demons, and the trainer knew these demons were more real than Gervonta could imagine. With each punch thrown at the heavy bag, Calvin saw the unresolved pain of a child who unconsciously searched for answers he didn't know existed. During training sessions, Calvin frequently noticed moments when Gervonta seemed lost in deep thought. The boy developed a complex personality, explosive and charismatic at some moments, but also introspective and melancholic at others. Calvin understood that this duality was directly related to the emotional void that Gervonta carried without knowing its origin. The trainer constantly questioned whether he was doing the right thing by maintaining silence, especially when he saw Gervonta struggling with issues of identity and belonging. The situation became even more complex when Gervonta began asking questions about his biological parents. He had accepted for years the simplified version his family had told him, but as he matured, his natural curiosity began to awaken. Calvin found himself in impossible situations, needing to deflect conversations or give vague answers when Gervonta expressed the desire to know more about his origins. The trainer felt he was betraying the young man's trust, but also knew that revealing the truth prematurely could destroy all the progress they had achieved together. The weight of the secret began affecting Calvin in ways he hadn't anticipated. He developed insomnia, spending entire nights questioning his choices. His wife, Dorothy, noticed changes in his behavior, but Calvin couldn't share the burden he carried even with her. The trainer found himself in emotional isolation, protecting a secret that was slowly corroding his own inner peace. He began writing letters to Gervonta that he never sent, trying to find the right words for a truth that seemed impossible to tell. As Gervonta became more successful in boxing, Calvin felt the weight of the secret increase proportionally. Each victory, each interview, each moment of glory was accompanied by awareness that there was a fundamental part of Gervonta's story that remained hidden. The trainer began questioning whether he was being fair to the boxing world and Gervonta's fans, who admired his story of overcoming without knowing the whole truth. It was an overwhelming responsibility that Calvin carried alone, knowing his decision affected not only Gervonta but also all those who were inspired by his journey. Calvin began to realize that keeping the secret was becoming more difficult as Gervonta gained national notoriety. Investigative journalists started showing interest in the boxer's personal story, and Calvin feared the truth might be discovered inappropriately, without the necessary care and context. He knew a moment would come when he could no longer protect Gervonta from reality, and this awareness kept him awake every night, planning how and when to reveal a secret he had kept for so long. As Gervonta grew and developed as a boxer, Calvin began noticing patterns in his behavior that seemed to echo the hidden truth about his origins. The young man demonstrated an inexplicable compulsion to help drug-addicted people he encountered on Baltimore's streets, frequently stopping to talk with them or offering money without expecting anything in return. Calvin observed these interactions with a heavy heart, knowing that Gervonta was unconsciously connecting with his biological mother's pain, even without knowing her story. There were also moments when Gervonta held a simple silver bracelet he he had found among his childhood belongings, turning it between his fingers with a distant and melancholic expression. Calvin recognized the bracelet. It was the same one Marcus, the biological father, had left behind. The family that raised him had kept this object without knowing its significance, and now Calvin watched Gervonta instinctively connect with this only physical link he had to his past. It was as if the young man knew, on some deep level, that there was more to his story than had been told. During the most intense training sessions, Gervonta frequently murmured words that Calvin recognized as fragments of repressed memories. He spoke about recurring dreams of a dark-haired woman who sang to him, dreams that Calvin knew were real memories from his first days of life with Tonya. The trainer observed these moments with a mixture of fascination and pain, seeing how Gervonta's mind was trying to process experiences he couldn't fully understand. It was evident that despite all efforts to protect him, some part of Gervonta still carried echoes of his true origin. Calvin also noticed that Gervonta had an inexplicable aversion to hospitals and medical environments. Whenever he needed mandatory medical exams for boxing, he became visibly agitated and anxious, unable to explain why he had this reaction. The trainer understood that this anxiety was related to traumas from his first days of life, when Gervonta had spent weeks in intensive care due to complications caused by drug exposure during pregnancy. These were emotional scars that persisted even without conscious memory of the events that caused them. Gervonta's behavior in relationships also reflected the impact of his hidden history. He demonstrated an intense need to be loved and accepted, but also a tendency to distance himself from people when they became too close. Calvin recognized this pattern as a defense mechanism developed by someone who had experienced profound abandonment in the first moments of life. The trainer felt guilty for not being able to offer Gervonta the emotional tools necessary to process these feelings, knowing that true healing could only come through knowledge and acceptance of his true history. As these signs became more evident, Calvin began to realize that keeping the secret wasn't really protecting Gervonta. It was just prolonging his journey of self-discovery and healing. The young boxer was clearly struggling with issues that could only be resolved through knowledge of his true origin. Calvin began questioning whether his protective instinct had become an obstacle to Gervonta's emotional growth, and this realization led him to seriously consider the possibility of finally revealing the truth he had kept for so long. Calvin's decision to finally reveal the secret was precipitated by an unexpected event during a press conference after one of Gervonta's most impressive victories. An investigative journalist named Brian Mitchell had spent months researching the boxer's personal history and asked a question that chilled Calvin's blood. He had found inconsistencies in public records about Gervonta's family and wanted to know if there was something the public didn't know about his origins. The question caught Gervonta by surprise, and Calvin saw in his eyes a mixture of confusion and suspicion that revealed the young man had already begun questioning the official narrative of his life. After the interview, Gervonta approached Calvin with an expression the trainer had never seen before, a mixture of determination and vulnerability that indicated he was ready to hear difficult truths. For the first time in 15 years, Gervonta asked the direct question that Calvin had always feared. He wanted to know if there was something about his past that was being hidden from him. The moment Calvin had so long avoided had finally arrived, and the trainer knew he could no longer escape the responsibility of telling the truth. The silence that followed the question seemed to last an eternity, but Calvin knew it was time to break the silent pact he had maintained for so long. Calvin asked Gervonta to meet him at the gym the next morning, explaining that there was something important he needed to share. The trainer spent that night organizing all the documents, photographs, and letters he had kept, mentally preparing for a conversation that would forever change the relationship between them. He practiced the words he would say, trying to find a gentle way to reveal such a powerful truth. Calvin knew there was no easy way to tell this story, but he also understood that Gervonta deserved to know the whole truth about his origins, regardless of how painful it might be. The next morning, the Upton Boxing Center was completely empty, creating an intimate and safe environment for the most important conversation of both their lives. Calvin had arrived 2 hours early, carefully organizing all the documents in chronological order, preparing a presentation that would tell the story completely, but with necessary care. When Gervonta arrived, Calvin noticed the young man had also prepared emotionally for what was to come. His posture and expression indicated he was ready to face any truth, no matter how difficult it might be. Calvin began the narrative from the beginning, explaining how he had discovered the secret and why he had chosen to keep it silent. He told about Keisha's call, about the documents found, about Tonya's letter, and about the bracelet left by Marcus. As the story unfolded, Calvin watched Gervonta's expressions change from initial shock to deep understanding that seemed to connect all the pieces of an emotional puzzle he had unconsciously carried his entire life. It was evident that on some level, Gervonta already knew there was more to his story than had been told. When Calvin finished telling the complete story, the gym fell into absolute silence for several minutes. Gervonta held his biological mother's letter with trembling hands, reading and rereading the words Tonya had written with so much love and regret. Calvin watched anxiously, prepared for any reaction: anger, sadness, relief, or a mixture of all these emotions. What he didn't expect was the response that came. Gervonta looked at him with tears in his eyes and said he finally understood why he had always felt different, why certain behaviors and feelings had never made complete sense until that moment. The revelation hadn't destroyed Gervonta. It had finally given him the answers he had unconsciously sought for years. In the weeks following the revelation, Calvin observed an extraordinary transformation in Gervonta that exceeded all his expectations. Far from being devastated by the truth, the young boxer seemed finally free from an invisible weight he had carried his entire life. His training became more focused and intentional, as if he finally understood what he was really fighting against. Calvin noticed that Gervonta had found a new source of motivation. He was no longer running from pain he didn't understand, but rather honoring the memory of a mother who had specifically chosen his name to represent protection and strength. Gervonta began speaking openly about his experience of discovering his true origins, but in a way that inspired rather than generated pity. He explained how the revelation had given him context for feelings and behaviors he had never been able to fully explain. The silver bracelet he always carried now had deep and special meaning, representing not just a connection to his biological father, but also a symbol that even in the most difficult circumstances, there is always something of value that remains. Calvin was impressed with the emotional maturity Gervonta demonstrated in processing this information. The relationship between Calvin and Gervonta also evolved to a completely new level of trust and mutual understanding. Gervonta expressed genuine gratitude for how Calvin had protected his emotional well-being during his formative years, recognizing that revealing this truth when he was younger could have been devastating. The young boxer understood that Calvin's decision to keep the secret hadn't been based on control or manipulation, but on genuine love and a protective instinct that recognized his emotional vulnerability at the time. This understanding significantly strengthened the bond between trainer and pupil. Calvin also experienced his own transformation by finally freeing himself from the burden of carrying this secret alone. The relief of no longer having to hide important information or deflect conversations about Gervonta's past was immense. The trainer realized that the secret had created a subtle barrier in his relationship with Gervonta that had now been completely removed. Calvin could finally be completely honest and open, allowing his guidance to be even more effective and meaningful. The experience also taught him valuable lessons about the complex balances between protection and honesty in important relationships. Gervonta began using his public platform to speak about issues related to drug addiction and its impacts on families, always approaching the topic with sensitivity and genuine understanding. He didn't exploit his own story to gain sympathy, but rather to offer hope to other people who might be going through similar situations. Calvin watched with pride as Gervonta had transformed his personal pain into a source of inspiration and support for others, demonstrating emotional wisdom that went far beyond his chronological age. The revelation also allowed Gervonta to finally make peace with aspects of his personality he had always considered problematic or confusing. His emotional intensity, his need to protect others, and his compulsion to help people in vulnerable situations now made complete sense. Calvin saw Gervonta accept himself completely for the first time, embracing both his strengths and vulnerabilities as integral parts of who he was. This self-acceptance was reflected not only in his personal life, but also in his performance in the ring, where he fought with a confidence and purpose Calvin had never seen before. Calvin's decision to make public the secret he had kept for 15 years created waves far beyond the boxing world. When the complete story was finally revealed through a carefully planned interview, the public's reaction was overwhelmingly positive and full of admiration for both Gervonta and Calvin. People not only understood the complexity of the situation and the difficulty of the decisions both had faced, but were also deeply moved by Gervonta's courage in sharing such an intimate part of his life. The narrative resonated with millions of people who had also grown up without fully knowing their own origins or who had faced similar family challenges. The revelation also had a significant impact on the Baltimore community, where Gervonta's story was already a source of local pride. Now, with the complete context of his journey, he became an even more powerful symbol of resilience and overcoming. Young people growing up in difficult circumstances found in Gervonta's story proof that it was possible not only to survive deep trauma, but also to transform it into sources of strength and purpose. Calvin observed how entire communities began adopting a more open and honest approach to complex family issues, inspired by the example of courage and vulnerability that Gervonta had demonstrated. The boxing world also responded extraordinarily to the revelation. Other athletes began sharing their own origin stories, creating a movement of greater transparency and authenticity in the sport. Calvin realized that Gervonta's decision to be open about his past had given permission for other fighters to talk about their own challenges and traumas, creating a more supportive and understanding environment. Promoters and sports organizations began implementing more robust psychological support resources, recognizing that many athletes carried complex stories that could benefit from adequate professional support. Sports media also changed its approach to covering athletes' personal stories, adopting a more nuanced and respectful perspective. Journalists who previously might have exploited sensational aspects of Gervonta's story now focused on the courage, growth, and positive impact his journey represented. Calvin was satisfied to see that the narrative had been framed in a way that honored both Tonya's memory and Gervonta's healing journey, without exploiting tragic aspects for cheap entertainment. Calvin began receiving contacts from other trainers and mentors facing similar situations with their own athletes. The experience of having navigated through such complex decisions about when and how to reveal sensitive information made him a valuable source of guidance for other professionals. He developed an informal support network for trainers dealing with athletes who had complicated family histories, sharing insights on how to balance protection and honesty, always keeping the athlete's well-being as the main priority. The story also inspired changes in social services and adoption policies, with organizations reviewing how information about biological origins is shared with adopted children. Calvin and Gervonta were invited to participate in panels and discussions about best practices for dealing with complex family histories, offering unique perspectives from both the mentor's point of view and the young person who lived the experience. Their contributions helped shape more sensitive and individualized guidelines for revealing difficult information about family origins, always considering the child's emotional and psychological development. 2 years after the public revelation of the secret Calvin had kept for so long, the lasting impact of his decision continued to expand in ways that neither he nor Gervonta could have anticipated. Gervonta had become not only a respected champion in the ring, but also a vocal advocate for transparency and emotional healing, using his platform to encourage others to face their own difficult truths. Calvin watched with deep pride as his former pupil had transformed a potentially traumatic experience into a source of strength that benefited not only himself but also countless others who were inspired by his journey. The Upton Boxing Center had become a pilgrimage site for young athletes and their trainers seeking to understand how to navigate through complex mentor-pupil relationships. Calvin regularly received visits from people who wanted to learn about his careful and reflective approach to making difficult decisions about the well-being of young people under his guidance. The veteran trainer had developed an informal mentorship program for other trainers, sharing lessons learned during his journey with Gervonta, and always emphasizing the importance of putting the athlete's emotional needs above all other considerations. Gervonta continued to honor his biological mother Tonya's memory in meaningful and personal ways. He established a discreet support program for pregnant women struggling with addiction, offering resources and treatment without judgment or excessive publicity. Calvin admired how Gervonta had channeled his pain into constructive action, creating opportunities for other families to avoid the tragedies that marked his early years of life. The program operated quietly, focusing on practical results rather than public recognition, reflecting the emotional maturity Gervonta had developed throughout his journey of self-discovery. The relationship between Calvin and Gervonta had evolved into something that transcended the traditional trainer-athlete dynamic. They had become true partners in the mission of helping other young people navigate through difficult circumstances, combining Calvin's experience as a mentor and Gervonta's unique perspective as someone who had overcome significant trauma. Together, they developed workshops and educational programs that taught young athletes about the importance of mental health, honest communication, and the value of having trustworthy mentors during challenging moments. Calvin frequently reflected on the lessons learned during the 15 years he kept the secret about Gervonta's origins. He had discovered that sometimes the deepest love requires incredibly difficult decisions, and that there are no simple answers when it comes to protecting someone you love deeply. The experience taught him that timing is crucial when revealing difficult truths, and that emotional preparation and appropriate context can make all the difference in how sensitive information is received and processed. These lessons became part of his general approach as a mentor, informing how he worked with new athletes who came to the gym carrying their own complex stories. The lasting legacy of Calvin's decision to finally reveal the secret he had kept wasn't just about an individual story of overcoming, but about the importance of relationships based on trust, unconditional love, and the courage to face difficult truths when the right moment arrives. Gervonta's journey of discovering his true origins and transforming that discovery into a source of strength had inspired a broader cultural change about how society approaches issues of trauma, adoption, and emotional healing. Calvin knew that the impact of his decision would continue to reverberate for generations, touching lives in ways he might never fully know, but that would always remind him that sometimes the greatest demonstrations of love require the most difficult decisions.
Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next cases.